Hello everybody, today I'm going to look at a very early Lord Byron poem called Lines Inscribed Upon a Cup Formed from a Skull. Quite a title, I know, and I'll return to that later. But this poem was written at Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire, Byron's ancestral home, in 1808, but it was published later in the 7th edition of Childe Harold, which is one of Byron's longer, more narrative pieces of poetry. As I've alluded to, it's an early poem, so Byron was only 19 years of age when he wrote it. And before we really delve into any piece of Byron's poetry, it's worth noting that he lived a very hedonistic and chaotic lifestyle. Later in his life, he became very much a high-profile celebrity, really, and he was well known as somebody who enjoyed a good party and enjoyed a good drink. Leslie Marchand puts this quite well by saying that his poetry evidences a romantic zest for life and experience. And despite the quite morbid themes of this poem, I think we do see this romantic zest for life and experience imbued within the poem. Later in Byron's life, his life really became peppered with numerous sexual scandals and racking up numerous debts, etc. So this poem really is a contemplation on hedonism and the superficiality of society. And like so many of the second generation romantics, such as Keats and Shelley, it is a poem that is concerned with mortality and the transience of life, the fleeting nature of life. But all of these aspects are commented on from a satirical perspective and from a satirical voice of this skull cup that has been hollowed out and used for drinking. You'll notice that death is not explored using the traditional Christian imagery, and that the images used are quite grotesque and linked to decay, which perhaps emphasises a implicit fear of death that's found within the poem. But as I've said, despite these quite morbid and nihilistic view of the world that's presented, the tone of the poem is humorous. It mocks high society that Byron would become a part of, and it is acutely aware of its own absurdity. If we look at the title itself, in essence this shows this. It's called Lines Inscribed Upon a Cup Formed from a Skull. Byron here is saying that he's pretty aware that this skull cannot speak, so he's saying that it's just lines inscribed upon the cup. Within his life, Byron did also have quite high-profile disagreements with the first wave of romantics, particularly Wordsworth. He didn't subscribe to Wordsworth's wholly benevolent view of nature, and some critics have also argued that this title is a young Byron throwing a little jab at Wordsworth by mocking some of Wordsworth's titles and his longer titles, poems such as Lines Written in Early Spring, or his more famous Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. So some have argued that this title is Byron parodying the titles of Wordsworth. What's important here is that this skull becomes a memento mori, a symbol and an object that shows the inevitability of death, a reminder of the inevitability of death. But in this poem, this skull becomes an implement for drinking, an act of hedonism, of zest of life, of indulgence. So again, we have this quite odd mix of hedonistic, indulgent behaviour and morbid death. And you'll see within this poem we are placed within a series of contradictions that I'll talk about later. Now, believe it or not, this skull cup did actually exist, and in one of Byron's letters he gives an account of this cup and basically the origins of this poem. He says the gardener in digging discovered a skull that had probably belonged to some jolly friar or monk of the abbey. Remember, this was written at Newstead Abbey, about the time that it was dismonastried. Observing it to be of giant size and in perfect state of preservation, a strange fancy seized me of having it set and mounted as a drinking cup. So this is true Byronic behaviour, hedonistic behaviour here. Trust Byron to look at this skull and think, oh, that's a decent sized skull. That'll make a good drinking cup. This is kind of Byron all over here. I accordingly sent it to town, and it returned with a very high polish and of a mottled colour like tortoise shell. And that is believed to be there in the top right hand corner, the cup. So as you can see, he's probably used the crown of the head by the looks of things. So if we look at the beginning of this poem, and remember, the speaker of the poem is this skull cup, it says, "Start not, nor deem my spirit fled." Now this is the skull cup warning us not to be startled, don't be worried. And it's quite an abrupt beginning, and you'll notice as we read through this poem there are several instructions from the skull cup that are hyphenated to grant them more emphasis. So start not, nor deem my spirit fled. Here we have a dual meaning of the word spirit. On one hand meaning the non-physical part of a person, but it's also, as you know, a class of alcohol. In me behold the only skull from which, unlike a living head, whatever flows is never dull. Now this is quite brilliant because we are immediately introduced to the satirical voice of the skull cup. It's saying here that unlike a living head, unlike living people, what flows from me, i.e. alcohol, wine, is never dull. So even in the first stanza, Byron is keen to criticise modern society and conformity, even within the first stanza. I lived, I loved, I quaffed like thee. Now quaffed just means drank, and this is what we would call an asyndetic tricolon. It's asyndetic because it doesn't contain any conjunctions. It's not I lived, I loved, and I quaffed. It's just a list without the conjunctions. And it's somewhat reminiscent of a quite famous tricolon of I came, I saw, I conquered. And I think here Byron is trying to subvert our expectations. If you think about these first two words, I lived, I loved, we would perhaps expect something like I lived, I loved, I lost. But no. This is Lord Byron we're talking about here. I lived, I loved, I quaffed, I drank. Then we have on the next line, I died. So Byron is wanting to make it really quite stark and clear that this skull cup is not alive. It's a thing of the past. And the caesura used here, perhaps to show that death is something that's abrupt and inescapable. Let my earth my bones resign. Fill up, thou canst not injure me. We have another instruction here. Drink up, fill up. The worm hath fouler lips than thine. So the skull invites the reader to drink. And it makes it clear that it's already dead, so it can no longer be injured. And we end the second stanza with a quite grotesque image of decay and death. And this is picked up again as we move on. Better to hold the sparkling grape than nurse the earthworm's slimy brood, and circle in the goblet's shape the drink of gods than reptiles' food. Notice here the quite striking, positive image of wine that's juxtaposed with the quite grotesque images surrounding death. The sparkling grape, the drink of gods, compared to reptiles' food and earthworms' slimy brood. If we think about this second line as well, nursing the earthworm's slimy brood, this word nurse, the quite positive maternal, that should say maternal, not material, but the positive maternal connotations of that word to nurse are skewed. And essentially here, the skull cup is arguing that it would rather hold wine within it than have to confront death and decay. Where once my wit, meaning intelligence, perhaps hath shone, in aid of others let me shine. So the skull cup here is saying that where my intelligence was, my brains, perhaps had shone once before and helped others, Let me shine again. Give me a sense of purpose. Now, you may think here that, and you are right in thinking this, that the language is quite old-fashioned. And this is true even for Byron's time. Words like hath and perchancen would not really be commonly used. And there is a deliberate use of archaic language within this poem to show how the skull is something of the past. It's removed from modernity and modern society. So this makes it quite an apt figure to start criticising it. And alas, when our brains are gone, so when our intelligence is gone and when our physical brains have gone, what nobler substitute than wine? And notice how wine here is again held up in quite a positive light. It's called the drink of the gods. It's been given nobility, whereas we would commonly associate wine as something that addles the brain more than anything. So the skull here is being provided with a kind of afterlife, a new purpose. And it's saying that, if I can't have brains in my head, I'd much rather have wine than anything else. So Byron has given this skull a quite strong and personal voice, and also a new purpose and a kind of afterlife. And within this, I suppose, the central question, particularly in these two stanzas, is Byron attempting to justify hedonism by saying, yeah, we only live for so long, life is fleeting, so why not make the most of it? Why not indulge and enjoy the drink of gods and the sparkling grape? And again, quite striking is that death is presented in a quite grotesque realism. No reference is made here to a kind of afterlife or traditional Christian imagery. Quaff whilst thou canst. Again, another instruction from the skull cup. This would be a great little line to have above a bar at a pub, I think. Another race. So another race will come along when thou and thine, like me, are sped, when we're dead, and they may rescue thee from earth's embrace and rhyme and revel with the dead. This is almost like seize the day type of attitude. Carpe diem. Make the most of life while you can. And as I mentioned earlier, it's showing an acute awareness of mortality, of death. So another race of human might come along when we're dead and rescue you from the earth. Now, this personification of Earth's embrace is quite an ironic idea. It's almost presenting death as inviting. But the skull cup is saying that perhaps you might be rescued from the earth and be given a new purpose and allow people to rhyme and revel with you, with the dead. And this is another example of quite stark juxtaposition and contrast. There is a juxtaposition of life and enjoyment, the rhyming and reveling, the hedonistic attitudes, and notice that alliteration, almost giving it a pleasant rhythm, and death, decay, contrasted with partying, with indulgence. And these two are perhaps inextricably linked for Byron. Why not? Notice that rhetorical question. He's saying, why not? Why not have a drink? Because life's day is little, since through life's little day our heads such sad effects produce. So the rhetorical question is essentially telling us to enjoy life while you can, since through life's little day, another example of the awareness of the fleeting nature of life, of the transience of life, the alliteration of life's little, also adds a kind of brevity to the phrase, makes it sound quite brief. And the skull cup is saying here that even when we're alive in the modern world, most of the time our heads such sad effects produce. We can think bad thoughts all the time. So why not try and indulge and enjoy life while you can? So another example of criticising the conformity of society and the lack of the individual. And remember, the voice of the romantic individual is such an important aspect of romantic poetry in general, the voice of the individual and individuality. Redeemed from worms and wasting clay, this chance is theirs to be of use. So Byron ends here by talking about the prospect of being revived. The worms, obviously, another example of the quite grotesque image of death and decay. And this clay could refer to soil, but it's also worth noting that clay was an element used in the creation of man in Genesis. So, despite the banality, the dullness of life, the skull has been given an afterlife and a chance to be remembered. So some key ideas here is that Byron uses the extended metaphor of the cup to speak to the reader, whilst also not disguising the fact that it's not alive. And this means that whilst reading it, we are placed in a series of contradictions. There is the new versus the old. Think about the language use. Life versus death. Purpose versus futility. The skull, remember, seems at least glad that now it's got a kind of purpose. And also, wrapped within all this, thinking about the quite humorous tone, there is horror, the earthworm's slimy brood, versus humour. Quaff whilst thou canst. And the poem, in an odd sense, seems quite fixated by death and fixated by the idea of death. And it doesn't always seem like a pleasant thing. But in some ways, it kind of downplays its significance and says, yeah, you might have the chance to be remembered. Enjoy life while you can. There is a distinct lack of Christian imagery, as I've mentioned, and there is almost an irreverence to death. It doesn't treat death in a way that we would expect society to treat such a sensitive subject. There is, and some would argue, the mere act of transforming this skull of a dead person into a drinking cup is quite an irreverent act, a quite disrespectful act in itself. The poem recognises the transience of life's little day, and remember that's a quote from the poem, and urges you to quaff whilst thou canst. And remember, it even asks this rhetorical question, why not? Come on, we're not here for forever. So make sure you make the most of things while you can. The form and structure of the poem, it's alternate rhyme scheme, AB, AB in quatrains, which it means 4-line stanzas, and it's written in iambic tetrameter. And the rhyme scheme and the meter really gives this poem a cyclical nature. If you notice, each stanza is a kind of separate thought, and it completes what it began. You won't notice this on the slides, but but you will in your book. But there are indentations on every other line, which sort of gives the poem a kind of unsettled energy, which is quite understandable for a speaker who has only just been unearthed. Thematically, this indentation is also a sign of Byron not really caring for the margin, not really caring for normality. And this is also shown, as I've mentioned, with regards to Byron's treatment of death. As it says here, Byron disregards reverence for death, a defining norm of society and of Christianity. He doesn't really give it that treatment. After all, he did look at the skull of a former jolly friar and think that would make a cracking wine glass. The cup also has quite a strong personal voice. Remember, there's the repetition of I, and there's also use of these hyphenated instructions to the reader. So those are some thoughts really on the poem. It's quite a humorous poem, and it's typical of a young Byron. I hope you've found it somewhat useful, and good luck with the rest of your studying.